Eloria traced the raised line of the scar that split her face, a permanent testament to the day her life had shattered. It began at her temple, a puckered silver-white trail that sliced across her cheekbone and ended just shy of her jaw. In the rigid, hierarchical world of the werewolf packs, where strength and physical perfection were prized above all else, her scar was more than a disfigurement. It was a brand, the mark of an outcast, a failure, an omega. The summons had arrived that morning, a scroll bearing the obsidian seal of the Alpha King. Panic, sharp and cold, had ripped through their small, disgraced household. The sovereign's choosing was an event meant for the proudest alphas, a chance for their pristine, powerful daughters to be presented as potential mates for the king. It was a political battlefield of beauty and ambition, a place her family no longer belonged. Her sister, Izarel, was their only hope. Izarel was everything Eloria was not. Flawless, graceful, with the confident bearing of the alpha blood that ran thin in their veins, but still held a flicker of its former fire. Her parents had poured every remaining resource into Izarel's upbringing, polishing her like a precious gem they hoped might buy back their honor. "He will choose you," their mother had whispered, clutching Izarel's hands, her eyes feverish with desperation. "He must." But fate, it seemed, had a crueler sense of humor. A sudden, violent illness had swept through Izarel the night before their departure, leaving her pale and racked with fever, unable to stand. Forfeiting the summons was not an option. It would be seen as a direct insult to the king, an act of defiance that would see their family exiled or worse. So, the decision was made. A whispered, frantic argument in the dead of night that ended with her father's defeated sigh. Eloria's would go in Izarel's place, not as a genuine candidate, but as a token, a placeholder, a walking apology for their family's failure. Now, standing in the cold antechamber of the great hall, she felt the weight of 1,000 hostile stares. She wore a simple gray dress, the best she owned, but it was homespun and drab compared to the silks and velvets of the other candidates. They were a flock of vibrant, preening birds of paradise, and she was a common sparrow, broken-winged and plain. Whispers followed her like shadows. "Look at her face. An omega? Here, the fallen house of Viridian has no shame." Eloria kept her eyes fixed on the stone floor, her hands clenched at her sides. Shame was a familiar cloak, one she had worn for years, but beneath it a strange resilience had taken root. She had learned to endure. She possessed a secret, a quiet strength that no one saw or understood. It was a peculiar empathy, an ability to feel the echoes of pain in others, and sometimes, if she concentrated, to soothe them. Most considered it a morbid curse, another sign of her defective nature. To her, it was simply a part of who she was, a silent language she shared with the hurting world. The great doors groaned open, and a herald's voice boomed, calling the name of a rival house. Another perfect daughter glided into the throne room. Eloria knew her turn was coming. She was not here to be chosen. She was here to be publicly shamed, a final, brutal confirmation of her and her family's worthlessness. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the humiliation to come. Her only goal was to survive it. The reputation of Alpha King Dareth preceded him like a storm front. They called him the Shadow King, the Iron Alpha, a ruler who had seized his throne at a young age after a brutal conflict that had left the old guard shattered. He was a recluse, a specter who governed from the imposing walls of his obsidian fortress. It was said he was merciless, that his power was absolute and terrifying. Most chilling were the rumors of a curse. Whispers in the dark spoke of a malady that isolated him, an affliction that made him untouchable. For a decade, he had rejected every potential mate, from the fiercest alpha daughters of the northern packs to the most beautiful sirens of the coastal clans. None were deemed worthy. None could get close. The herald's voice finally called her name, or rather, her family's. Lady Eloria of the fallen house Viridian, in place of her sister, Izirel. The addition was a deliberate barb, a twist of the knife for all to hear. A collective, derisive snort rippled through the gathered court. Eloria felt a hot flush creep up her neck, but she forced her chin up and walked forward. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cower. The throne room was vast and cold, dominated by shadows that clung to the high vaulted ceilings. At the far end, upon a throne carved from a single piece of black stone, sat the king. He was a silhouette against the dim light filtering through a high window. All she could make out was a broad, powerful frame and the chilling gleam of the silver mask that covered the upper half of his face. It was intricately worked, shaped like a snarling wolf, but its empty eye sockets seemed to absorb all the light and warmth in the room. His power was a physical force. It pressed down on her, an oppressive weight that made the air thick and hard to breathe. It was ancient and raw, laced with something else, a jagged edge of relentless, unending pain. Her own strange gift resonated with it instantly, a low thrum of agony that vibrated deep in her bones. It was the most profound suffering she had ever sensed. She stopped at the required distance and sank into a clumsy curtsy, her eyes still on the floor. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. She could feel the court's amusement turning to confusion. The king was supposed to dismiss her with a contemptuous flick of his wrist. Instead, he spoke. His voice was a low growl, rough and strained, as if forcing the words through gravel. "You are not the one named in the summons." It was a statement, not a question. "My sister fell ill, Your Majesty," Eloria said, her own voice barely a whisper. "I came so my family would not show you disrespect." Another long pause. She could feel his focus narrow, a predatory intensity that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. The phantom ache emanating from him sharpened. Then he asked the strangest question. "Step closer." She obeyed, her heart hammering against her ribs. He leaned forward slightly, his masked gaze seeming to bore right through her. "That mark on your face," he rasped, the words sending a shiver down her spine. "Tell me, what do you know of scars?" The question hung in the air, baffling the assembled nobles. They had expected inquiries about lineage, dowry, or pack allegiance. Instead, the fearsome king was asking a ruined Omega about her disfigurement. Eoloria's mind went blank for a second, the directness of his query disarming her. She met the empty eye holes of his mask, trying to find the man behind the terrifying legend. The agony she sensed from him was a constant grinding hum, a baseline of torment he must live with every second of every day. For the first time, she felt not fear, but a flicker of kinship. "I know," she began, her voice gaining a sliver of confidence, "that they are a map of where you have been. I know they do not heal straight. and I know they ache when a storm is coming." A low murmur swept through the court, a mix of shock and scorn at her audacity, but the king did not move. He remained utterly still, his posture rigid. The air around the throne seemed to crackle with a tension that had nothing to do with royal authority and everything to do with a deeply personal wound. He considered her words for a long moment. No one dared to breathe. The other beautiful candidates who had stood with such pride now seemed like porcelain dolls, fragile and irrelevant. They knew nothing of scars. Finally, King Dareth raised a gauntleted hand, not to dismiss her, but to silence the whispers. He addressed his regent, his voice carrying an unmistakable command. "Lord Zorthan, the choosing is concluded for the day. The other candidates are dismissed." A wave of stunned disbelief washed over the hall. Dismissed? All of them? Lord Zorthan, a hard-faced alpha with silvering hair and cold, calculating eyes, stepped forward. He was the king's uncle, a man who wielded immense influence. "Your Majesty? Surely you do not mean—" "I mean precisely what I said." Dareth cut him off, his tone dropping to a dangerous growl. The oppressive weight of his power intensified, and Zorthan wisely fell silent, though his jaw was tight with fury. Dareth's masked gaze then fell back to Eloria. "You will remain." If the previous announcement had caused a shock, this one was a cataclysm. Eloria felt her blood run cold. Remain? Why? What could he possibly want with her? The court erupted into a chaotic buzz of speculation. Lord Zorthan shot her a look of pure venom, his eyes promising retribution. Guards escorted the other women out, their expressions a mixture of outrage and confusion. Soon, the great hall was empty, save for Eloria, the king on his throne, and a handful of his personal guard. "You will be given chambers in the West Wing," the king stated, rising from his throne. He was even larger than she had imagined, a mountain of dark leather and muscle. "You are not a prisoner, but you will not leave the castle grounds. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Majesty," she stammered, completely overwhelmed. He started to descend the dais, his movements stiff and controlled. As he passed her, the wave of his pain washed over her so intensely it made her dizzy. It was a physical, searing agony, sharp as broken glass, and deep as a poisoned well. He paused for a fraction of a second, his masked face turned toward her. "We will speak again," he said, the words a strained promise. Then he swept past, leaving her alone in the cavernous hall, trembling and utterly bewildered. She was trapped, a pawn in a game she did not understand, bound to a king whose suffering was a silent scream that only she could hear. The chambers Eloria was given were not the lavish suites prepared for the alpha candidates. They were simple, functional rooms in a quiet, disused wing of the fortress. Stone walls, a sturdy bed, a small hearth. It felt less like a guest room and more like a comfortable cell. She was watched constantly. Guards stood silent sentinel at the end of her corridor. Servants brought her meals, their faces impassive, their eyes filled with a fearful curiosity. She was the Omega with the scar, the bizarre creature the Shadow King had inexplicably kept. Days bled into a week. She saw no one. She spoke to no one. The king did not summon her. The isolation was a heavy blanket, but it was the proximity to him that truly frayed her nerves. His chambers, she soon realized, were nearby. Through the thick stone walls, she could feel the pulsating rhythm of his pain. It was a constant presence, a dark star around which her own senses now orbited. Some nights were worse than others. On those nights, the agony radiating from him became a palpable force, a tide of suffering that seeped into her rooms and left her breathless. She would lie awake, her own body aching in sympathy, her hands clenched in the sheets as she fought the overwhelming urge to go to him, to try and offer some comfort, however small. One night, the wave of his torment was so violent it felt like a physical blow. A silent, psychic scream echoed through the castle, one she was sure only she could perceive. It was raw, desperate, and stripped of all the control he so carefully maintained. Unable to bear it any longer, she rose from her bed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Driven by an instinct she couldn't explain, she slipped out of her room. The guards were gone, a temporary shift change, perhaps. The corridor was empty, lit only by the faint moonlight slanting through a high, arrow-slit window. She followed the pull of his pain, a beacon in the darkness, leading her down halls and through archways she didn't recognize. She found herself before a pair of massive, iron-bound doors. The agony from within was a roaring inferno. Pushing past her fear, she pressed one of the doors. It swung inward with a low groan. The room was Dareth's private study, filled with books and maps, but she barely noticed. He was there, by the great hearth where the fire had died to embers. He had thrown off his tunic, and his back was to her. In the dim light, she saw the source of the rumors, the truth of his curse. His skin was a canvas of torment. Jagged, black, crystalline shards, like thorns of solidified shadow, grew from his flesh, concentrated over his shoulders and spine. They pulsed with a faint, malevolent light, and she knew with absolute certainty that to touch them would be to feel unimaginable pain. He was braced against the mantelpiece, his head bowed, his entire body rigid with the effort of containing his suffering. He didn't seem to notice her. He was lost in his own private hell. The sight was horrifying, yet her gift didn't register monstrosity. It registered only pain, a level of pain that should have killed any man. Without thinking, without a plan, she took a hesitant step into the room. "Your Majesty," she whispered. His head snapped up. He spun around, his eyes, visible beneath the mask, wide with shock and fury. "Get out!" he roared, the sound more animal than man. But Aeloria didn't run. She stood her ground, her gaze fixed on the torment etched into every line of his body. She held up her hands, not in surrender, but in a gesture of peace. I can help," she said, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "No one can help," he snarled, taking a staggering step back. "Now leave before you see worse." "I am not afraid," she said softly, and it was the truth. She was terrified of his power, of his position, but not of his pain. His pain was something she understood. Closing her eyes, she reached out, not with her hands, but with her mind, with the core of her strange gift. She focused on the jagged edges of his agony, not trying to take it, but to smooth it, to pour a balm of quiet calm over the raging fire. She thought of cool water, of silent snowfalls, of the deep peace of a forest at midnight. Dareth froze. The rigid tension in his shoulders lessened by a fraction. He stared at her, the fury in his eyes slowly being replaced by a dawning, incredulous disbelief. "What?" "What are you doing?" he breathed. "I'm quieting the storm," she whispered back, opening her eyes. For the first time since she had arrived, the suffocating aura of his pain receded, even if just for a moment. He looked at her, the scarred Omega girl, and in the depths of his shadowed eyes, she saw not a king, but a man who had just felt his first moment of peace in a lifetime of agony. That night established a new, secret routine. It was an unspoken arrangement. When the pain became unbearable, a servant would silently appear at Eloria's door with a cup of herbal tea, a signal. She would wait an hour, then slip through the darkened halls to his study. He never spoke of his curse, and she never asked. He would sit by the fire, his back to her, and she would sit in a chair across the room. She would not touch him, but she would reach out with her gift, gently blunting the sharpest edges of his suffering. It was exhausting work. She often left his chambers feeling drained and hollowed out, as if she had run for miles, but she never refused the summons. To fill the heavy silence, she began to talk. She told him stories from her childhood, simple tales of the woods behind her family home, of the shapes of clouds, of the songs her grandmother used to sing. They were small, insignificant things, but in the oppressive darkness of his world, they were tiny points of light. He, in turn, began to speak, not of himself, but of his kingdom. He spoke of the rugged mountains to the north, of the treacherous politics of the river clans, of his frustrations with the greed and short-sightedness of his nobles. He was a brilliant strategist and a deeply committed ruler, trapped within a prison of his own flesh. He started asking for her opinion. "The grain dispute in the western plains," he'd say, his voice a low rumble. "Lord Calvrin wants to impose a tax that will starve the smaller farms. What would your grandmother have said about a man who eats his own seed corn?" She would answer simply, drawing on the common-sense wisdom of a life lived far from the machinations of power. She would have said he's a fool who mistakes his stomach for a legacy. A low, rough sound would escape him, one she eventually identified as a choked laugh. In those moments, he was not the Shadow King. He was just Dareth, and he was beginning to see her not as a scarred Omega, but as Eloria, his confidant, his anchor. This fragile piece, however, did not go unnoticed. Lord Zorthan watched them with an eagle's eye. He saw the slight easing of the king's perpetual tension, the way his focus in council meetings seemed sharper. And he saw the Omega girl no longer just a court anomaly, but a potential source of influence, a threat to his own. Zorthan began his campaign subtly. He spread rumors. The Omega was a witch, using dark arts to ensnare the king. Her scar was not a mark of weakness, but of a demonic pact. He ensured she was isolated, turning the few servants who had shown her kindness against her with threats and bribes. One afternoon, as Eloria walked in the small walled garden she was permitted to use, Zorthan cornered her. His presence was oily and menacing, a stark contrast to Dareth's raw, honest power. "You are playing a dangerous game, little Omega," he said, his voice a silken threat. "The king is a broken thing. Whatever parlor tricks you are using to beguile him will not last." "I am doing nothing," Eloria said, her chin high. She would not let him see her fear. "Are you?" he sneered, stepping closer. "He is weak. His curse has rotted his mind. He needs a strong hand to guide the kingdom, an alpha queen at his side to secure the bloodline, not a barren, broken thing like you." The word barren was a deliberate, cruel blow, a common insult hurled at Omegas. But it was his next move that terrified her. "Your family," he said softly, watching her reaction. "They are in a precarious position. It would be a shame if some new misfortune were to befall them. A fire, perhaps, or an accusation of treason. Such things are so easily arranged." Ice flooded Gloria's veins. He was threatening her family, the very people who had cast her out, but who she still felt a desperate duty to protect. "Stay away from him," Zorthan commanded. "Let him choose a proper mate. Your cooperation will ensure your family's continued, if miserable, existence." He smiled, a cold, predatory baring of teeth, and then he was gone, leaving her standing amidst the wilting roses, her fragile world threatening to collapse. The threat settled deep in Aloria's soul, a cold stone of dread. Zorthan was not a man who made idle promises. She knew he was capable of any cruelty to achieve his ends. That night, when the servant came with the customary cup of tea, Aloria hesitated. To go to Dareth was to defy his uncle and endanger her family. To stay away was to leave him to his torment, a thought that had become physically painful to her. Her heart won out over her head. She could not abandon him. She found Dareth in a worse state than she had ever seen him. The crystalline thorns on his back were larger, sharper, and they seemed to be spreading, creeping over his shoulders toward his neck. He was pacing the room like a caged beast, his breathing ragged. "It is worse tonight," he growled, without turning as she entered. "Your stories will not be enough." "Then I will not tell stories," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She walked closer than she ever had before, stopping only a few feet from him. The air around him shimmered with heat, with raw, unshielded agony. He finally turned to face her. In the firelight, his mask seemed more menacing than ever, but she forced herself to look past it, to meet the desperate eyes she could just make out in the shadows beneath. "Zorthan spoke to you," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I smelled his scent on you when you entered." Aloria flinched, but did not deny it. "He wants me to leave." "And will you?" The question was rough, torn from him. "He threatened my family." The admission was a choked whisper. A terrible, guttural snarl ripped from Dareth's throat. A wave of fury and power exploded from him, so potent that a wine goblet on a nearby table shattered. The thorns on his skin pulsed violently. "He will not touch them," Dareth vowed, his voice a deadly promise. "They are under my protection, all of them, because of you." The declaration hung between them, a shield she hadn't known she possessed. Relief warred with a new, more complicated emotion. He was protecting her, fiercely, but his outburst came at a cost. He staggered, crying out as a fresh wave of pain seized him. The curse was feeding on his rage, growing stronger. He collapsed to one knee, his body convulsing. "Your Majesty! Dareth!" She rushed forward, forgetting all warnings, all protocols. He threw up a hand to ward her off. "Don't! Do not touch me, Aloria! It will kill you!" Suddenly, the great doors to the study burst open. Lord Zorthan stood there, flanked by two of his most loyal guards. He had planned this. He had goaded Dareth, knowing his rage would trigger the curse, and had brought witnesses to see the king in his most monstrous state. Behold your king! Zorthan boomed, his voice ringing with triumphant malice. A monster, brought to his knees by a cursed Omega witch. He is unfit to rule. Dareth struggled to rise, to project an aura of command, but the agony was too great. His control was gone. The shadowy thorns writhed, growing before their very eyes, consuming him. He looked not like a king, but a creature from a nightmare. Zorthan's guards drew their swords, their faces a mixture of fear and grim determination. They were going to end this. They were going to kill their king. Aeloria reacted on pure instinct. She would not let them harm him. She would not let him be seen this way, be remembered this way. With a cry, she threw herself in front of Dareth, spreading her arms wide to shield his kneeling form with her own small body. "You will not touch him!" she declared, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Step aside, foolish girl." Zorthan sneered. "His madness will consume you both." "It is not madness," she retorted, her eyes locked on his. "It is pain, something a heartless creature like you could never comprehend." Behind her, Dareth let out a choked sound. He stared at her back, at this slight, scarred Omega who was defying a powerful lord and his armed guards to protect him. This selfless, insane act of courage struck him with more force than any physical blow. At that moment, as she stood as his defiant shield, a profound, undeniable truth slammed into him. This was not just about comfort. It was not just about gratitude. It was the mate bond, the primal call of his soul roaring to life. She was his mate, the one foretold, the one who could withstand his darkness. "Aeloria," he breathed, the name a prayer. He surged to his feet, ignoring the searing agony. A wave of raw, untamed power, black and terrifying, erupted from him. It was not aimed at Aeloria, but flowed around her like a protective cloak, slamming into Zorthan and his men. The guards were thrown back against the far wall, stunned and breathless. Zorthan himself was forced to his knees, gasping under the immense pressure. The effort, however, was too much. The thorns on Dareth's body flared with an agonizing light, and he cried out, his legs buckling. As he fell, his mask was knocked aside, clattering to the stone floor. For the first time, Aeloria saw his face. It was a strong, noble face, with a square jaw and high cheekbones. But it was ravaged, a mirror of her own scar, but infinitely worse. A web of black, crystalline lines, like frozen lightning, covered the entire left side of his face, radiating from a temple that was a mass of twisted, thorny tissue. His left eye was clouded and blind. He was beautiful and broken, and in that moment she loved him with a terrifying, all-consuming certainty. Ignoring his previous warnings, ignoring the danger, she knelt and did the one thing she knew she had to do. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers gently tracing the cursed lines on his skin. A bolt of pure, unadulterated agony shot up her arm. It was a white-hot fire, 1,000 knives stabbing into her at once. She screamed, but she did not pull away. Instead, she poured all of her being, all of her gift, into the touch. She took the full, unfiltered brunt of his curse into herself, a willing sacrifice. The pain was excruciating, and the world dissolved into a vortex of white noise and darkness. Her last conscious thought was of his one good eye, wide with horror and a dawning, heartbreaking adoration as she collapsed beside him. Dareth roared as Aeloria's body went limp. Her scream, a sound of pure agony, had shattered something deep within him. He felt the raw power of his curse slam into her, and then, impossibly, he felt her gift meet it. It was like a tidal wave of fire meeting a cool, endless sea. For a breathtaking second, the pain inside him vanished, replaced by a profound sense of peace, of rightness. But the cost was too high. She had collapsed, her life force flickering like a dying candle flame. "You!" he snarled, his voice a death rattle. He turned his unmasked, terrifying face to his uncle. Zorthan was scrambling to his feet, his triumph curdled into pure terror. "You have killed her!" The love and fury and despair coalesced inside him, and his power, which he had fought to control his entire life, answered a new master, his fated mate. He no longer sought to contain it. He sought to wield it. Shadows boiled in the corners of the room, coalescing around him. "He is a monster!" Zorthan shrieked to his dazed guards. "He is lost! Kill him! For the good of the kingdom!" But the guards hesitated. They had just witnessed the Omega Girl sacrifice herself for their king, and they had seen the king's power lash out not in madness, but in defense of her. They were warriors, and they recognized the primal fury of a male protecting his mate. Before they could decide, the doors to the study flew open again. This time it was Captain Corain, the loyal head of Dareth's personal guard, followed by a dozen elite soldiers. They took in the scene at a glance. The unmasked king, radiant with dark power, the unconscious Omega in his arms, the treacherous Lord Zorthan and his two cornered men. "My king," Corain said, his voice firm as he knelt, ignoring the shocking sight of Dareth's face. "Your orders?" "Arrest him!" Dareth commanded, his voice shaking with restrained violence. He gently gathered Aeloria into his arms, cradling her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Arrest my uncle for high treason! He laid a hand on my queen!" The title fell into the stunned silence of the room. Queen? He had named her. The scarred, broken Omega. His queen. Zorthan paled, his ambitions turning to ash in his mouth. "You are mad!" Zorthan spat as Corain's men seized him. "The council will never accept this. They will never accept her. They will accept their queen, or they will face me," Dareth said, his voice dangerously soft. He looked down at Aeloria's pale face, at the faint scar that had first drawn him to her. "She is my mate, my anchor, and you tried to destroy her." He swept past them, carrying Aeloria as if she weighed nothing. He did not go to her chambers, but strode directly toward the royal apartments, toward the king's own bedchamber, a place no woman had entered for over a decade. He ignored the shocked gasps of the servants and guards they passed in the halls, his focus solely on the fragile life he held. He laid her gently on his massive bed. Her breathing was shallow, her skin deathly cold. Her selfless act had saved him from losing control, but it had nearly extinguished her own light. Panic, an emotion he hadn't felt in years, clawed at him. He was a king, a warrior, a being of immense power, but he was helpless to save her. Desperate, he pressed his forehead to hers, closing his eyes. He focused on the nascent mate bond, the shimmering thread that now connected their souls. He poured all of his will, his love, his very essence into that bond, a silent plea for her to stay, to fight, to come back to him. He didn't know if it would work, but he had to try. He would not lose her. He had only just found her. Eloria drifted in a gray, painless void. The agony of taking on Dareth's curse had been so absolute that it had burned away all other sensations. She was aware of a distant warmth, a persistent, gentle call that pulsed in time with a heartbeat that was not her own. It was a lifeline, a golden thread in the suffocating darkness, and she clung to it with the last vestiges of her will. Slowly, the warmth solidified into a feeling of comfort, of safety. The golden thread became stronger, a conduit pouring strength and a desperate, unwavering love into her. It was Dareth. He was calling her back. Her eyelids fluttered open. She was lying in a vast, comfortable bed, the likes of which she had never seen. The room was regal and masculine, decorated in dark woods and rich crimson tapestries. Dareth was sitting in a chair beside the bed, his head in his hands. He was shirtless, and she saw that the horrific thorns of his curse were gone. In their place was a network of faint, silvery scars like lightning frozen under his skin. He had taken off his mask, and his scarred face was etched with exhaustion and fear. "Dareth!" Her voice was a dry rasp. His head shot up. The relief that flooded his features was so potent it was breathtaking. In 2 strides, he was at her side, kneeling by the bed, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm and solid, and for the first time, it held no trace of pain. "Eloria," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "You came back." "The curse," she whispered, her eyes tracing the faded marks on his skin. It's quiet," he finished for her, a sense of wonder in his voice. "When you touched me, when you took it all, you didn't just soothe it, you broke its hold. It is not gone, but it is dormant. I can control it." He looked at her, his one good eye shining with an emotion so intense it made her heart ache. "You saved me. You saved me too," she replied, thinking of the golden thread of his will that had pulled her back from the edge. "You called me home." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a reverence that humbled her. "I have called a meeting of the full council," he said, his tone turning serious. "Zorthan is in the dungeons, but his poison has already spread. Many of the alphas are restless. They believe I am mad, that you have enchanted me." Fear fluttered in her chest. "What will you do?" "I will present them with their queen," he said simply, his gaze unwavering. "And I will dare any of them to challenge my choice." The council meeting was held in the great throne room, the same room where Eloria had been presented as a joke. This time, however, she entered not as a supplicant, but on the king's arm. She wore a gown of deep blue velvet, a gift from Dareth, and her hair was unbound. She did not try to hide her scar. Dareth, too, was unmasked, bearing his own scars for all to see. Their entrance was met with a thunderous silence. The assembled Alpha Lords stared, their faces a mixture of awe, fear, and outrage. Dareth led her not to a seat beside the throne, but to the throne itself. He had her sit, and he remained standing beside her, a clear and undeniable statement of her new status. "For 10 years," Dareth began, his voice echoing in the vast hall, "I have borne a curse that has isolated me and left my kingdom without a queen. Many of you saw this as a weakness." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "You were wrong. It was a test, a crucible waiting for a soul strong enough to withstand its fire. His eyes found Aeloria's. I have found that soul. Aeloria of House Viridian is my fated mate. Her courage saved my life. Her strength has tempered my curse. She is not the queen you expected, but she is the queen this kingdom needs. She is my queen. A grizzled old alpha, Lord Calvrin from the Western Plains, stepped forward. Your Majesty, she is an Omega. She has a scar of weakness. How can she possibly bear a true alpha heir? Before Dareth could unleash his fury, Aeloria stood. All eyes turned to her. You are right, my lord, she said, her voice clear and steady. I am an Omega, and I bear this scar. She touched her face. But you mistake the nature of strength. You see it only in muscle and fang. But there is strength in endurance. There is strength in empathy. And there is strength in healing wounds, rather than just inflicting them. She looked from Calvrin to the other uncertain faces. This kingdom is scarred, just like its king, just like me. It is divided by pride and prejudice. It does not need another warrior. It needs a healer. Her words, spoken with a quiet dignity and undeniable truth, resonated through the hall. The alphas looked at their unmasked king, at the peace that now settled on his features, where once there was only tension and pain. They looked at the small Omega who stood beside him, unintimidated and proud. They saw not a witch, but a woman of incredible fortitude. But Zorthon's poison ran deep. A faction of lords, loyal to the old ways and to Dareth's uncle, remained defiant. One of them, a brutish alpha named Osrathon, drew his blade. This is a mockery. We will not be ruled by a broken king and his Omega pet. It was the spark that ignited the powder keg. The chamber erupted as loyalists and rebels drew their weapons. But the final confrontation would not be decided by a battle. It would be decided by a single act of treachery. In the chaos, a figure slipped from the shadows near the throne. It was one of Zorthon's guards, freed from the dungeon by conspirators. He held a small, wicked-looking dagger, its blade coated in a sickly green paste. It was not wolfsbane. It was something far older, a poison designed to sever the nascent bonds of fated mates by turning a mate's own power against them. His target was not the king. It was the queen. He lunged, faster than anyone could react. Dareth saw the movement at the last second. He roared Aeloria's name, a sound of pure terror, and threw himself in front of her. But the assassin was swift. The blade, intended for Aeloria's heart, plunged deep into Dareth's side. A collective gasp of horror sucked the air from the room. The fighting stuttered to a halt. Dareth stood for a moment, his eyes wide with shock, before he staggered back, clutching the dagger embedded in his side. A strange, black energy, veined with sickly green, began to spread from the wound, crawling over his skin like venomous spiders. The poison was horrific. It didn't just attack his body, it attacked the mate bond. Aeloria felt a searing, vicarious agony, but worse was the chilling sensation of the bond itself beginning to fray, to turn toxic. The poison was designed to make her gift, her healing empathy, a weapon against him, feeding his dormant curse with her own life force until they both consumed each other. Dareth! She screamed, rushing to his side as he fell to his knees. The assassin, seeing his work done, tried to flee, but Captain Corraine cut him down with a single, brutal stroke of his sword. Aeloria knelt before her king, her mate, her hands hovering over the terrible wound. Panic seized her. Her healing touch was now a weapon. If she tried to soothe his pain, the poison would use her power to fuel the curse and kill him faster. "Eloria!" Dareth gasped, his one good eye finding hers. His skin was turning gray, the silvery scars on his body beginning to glow with a dark, angry light as the curse began to reawaken. "The bond, it's tearing, it hurts." He was dying. The lords, both loyal and rebellious, watched in stunned silence. Their world was balanced on a knife's edge. In that moment of absolute desperation, Eloria understood. The poison used the bond, a conduit of love and power, as its delivery system. But a conduit worked both ways. Zorthan and his cronies had misunderstood the nature of her strength. They saw it as a tool, but it wasn't. It was a part of her soul. She looked at Dareth, at the man who had seen past her scar to the person beneath, who had named her his queen, who had just taken a poisoned blade for her. Love, fierce and boundless, swelled in her heart. This was her choice. This was her king. This was her mate. "I love you, Dareth," she whispered. The words, a vow, an anchor in the storm. Then she did the one thing the poison was not designed for. She did not try to heal him. She did not try to soothe him. Instead, she laid her hands over his, which were clutched at his side, and she did the opposite of what her gift was meant to do. She pulled. With every ounce of her will, she drew the poison and the raging, reawakening curse into herself. She used the mate bond as a siphon, pulling the darkness out of his body and into her own. The pain is beyond imagining. It was a fire that consumed her from the inside out, a symphony of agony that dwarfed even the moment she had first touched his curse. Her vision blackened, and she felt her own life slipping away, but she held on, her focus absolute. She would be his shield, even if it meant her own end. The entire court watched in breathless awe as the black veins of poison receded from Dareth's skin and seemed to flow into Eloria. Her own scar began to glow with a terrifying dark light. She was taking on the full, combined force of a lethal poison and a decade-old curse. She was sacrificing herself. Dareth felt the darkness leave him. He felt the bond, once tearing, now pulsing with her incredible selfless love. He saw her face, contorted in agony, and knew what she was doing. "No!" he cried, trying to push her away, but he was too weak. As the last of the poison left him, Eloria collapsed. But something miraculous happened. The moment the combined darkness fully entered her, it met the unshakable core of her being, the pure, unconditional love she held for her mate. It was a force the curse had never before encountered. Love was its antithesis. A blinding golden light erupted from Eloria. It was warm and pure, a stark contrast to the malevolent energy she had absorbed. The light pulsed outward, washing over Dareth first, and he felt the last vestiges of his curse, the dormancy, the scars, the pain, dissolve into nothing. He was not just healed, he was cleansed. He was whole. The light washed over the entire throne room. It touched every lord, every guard, and in it they felt not power, but compassion. They felt the depth of Eloria's sacrifice and the unyielding strength of her love. Prejudices and old hatreds seemed petty and small in the face of such a profound act. When the light faded, Eloria lay still on the floor. Dareth, now completely restored, scrambled to her side, his heart shattered. He had lost her. But then she stirred. Her eyes opened, bright and clear. The angry glow had faded from her scar, and it seemed softer, just a silvery line on her skin. She had faced down death and darkness and had won. Her gift, amplified by a true mate's love, had not just saved him. It had purified them both. Dareth let out a ragged sob of relief and gathered her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. You saved us all," he whispered. And in the silent, awe-filled throne room, Lord Calvrin, the grizzled alpha who had first challenged her, slowly knelt. Then another lord, and another. Soon, every single person in the hall, loyalist and former rebel alike, was kneeling before the scarred Omega, who had become the heart of their kingdom. They were not just kneeling to their king. They were kneeling to their true queen. With the last vestiges of rebellion quelled by a miracle, the kingdom was unified as never before. Dareth, free from the pain that had clouded his reign, ruled with a new clarity and compassion, but he made no decision without Ealoria by his side. The formal mating ceremony was held a week later, not in the cold throne room, but in the sunlit central courtyard, attended by alphas, betas, and omegas alike. When Dareth bent his head to mark her, sealing their bond before the eyes of their people and the spirits of their ancestors, it was more than the union of a king and his queen. It was the dawn of a new era. The rigid caste system began to crumble. Ealoria championed the rights of omegas, establishing schools and guilds, ensuring that no one would be judged for their birth rank or for the scars they carried. Worth, she decreed, was found in the heart, and strength was measured in kindness. The Shadow King was no more. In his place stood King Dareth, the healed king, who ruled with his queen, Ealoria, the steadfast. Their love story became a legend, a tale told by hearthsides to inspire hope in the darkest of times. The fortress that had once been a symbol of fear and isolation became a place of warmth and justice. 1 year later, Ealoria stood on the balcony of their chambers, a gentle breeze stirring her hair. Dareth came up behind her, wrapping his strong arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. His touch was a familiar comfort, a constant source of warmth and safety. Below them, the capital city bustled with peaceful energy, a testament to the changes they had wrought. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his lips brushing her temple. "I was thinking about scars," she said softly, her hand instinctively going to the line on her cheek. It was a part of her, a map of where she had been, but it no longer defined her. And how they don't have to be the end of a story. "For us," he said, turning her in his arms to face him, "they were the beginning." He looked down at her, his eyes filled with a love so deep it still sometimes stole her breath away. His gaze dropped to her gently swelling belly. "And the beginning of our future." A small, powerful kick from within made her gasp and then laugh. The royal healers had been stunned. An Omega, they had said, could never bear a true alpha heir. But the child Ealoria carried was a symbol of their bond, a miracle born of a love that had defied curses, poisons, and prejudice. This child would not be born into a world of rigid hierarchy, but into a kingdom that was learning to heal. Dareth placed a reverent hand on her stomach, his face alight with a joy he had never thought he would know. "They will be strong," he whispered, "like their mother." Ealoria smiled, leaning her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. The scarred Omega and the cursed king had found their peace, not in perfection, but in the beautiful, flawed reality of each other. They had saved their kingdom, but more importantly, they had saved each other, proving that the greatest strength of all was not the power to rule, but the courage to love. And as they stood on the balcony, their united kingdom thriving below and their future stirring to life between them, they knew their story was just beginning.